November 1918. In Western Europe, the 4-year slaughter of World War I is drawing to an end. But across the former Russian Empire, a new conflict has broken out. A civil war that rages from Central Europe to the Pacific and will claim an estimated 9 million lives. Lenin, the Bolsheviks and their new Soviet Republic battle for survival against their many enemies, collectively known as the Whites. The Whites' great hope, their newly appointed supreme ruler of Russia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak. He is a war hero, a man of duty and discipline, who believes above all in service to the motherland. Millions look to him to crush the Bolsheviks, avenge the murdered Tsar, and save Russia from chaos and collapse. This is the extraordinary tale of the life and death of Admiral Kolchak, Russia's only supreme ruler. The Arctic Ocean, 1900. Russian scientific vessel Zarya sails east on a voyage of discovery to the outer fringes of the Russian Empire. The expedition leader is Baron Eduard von Toll, a renowned Russian explorer and geologist. He intends to explore the Arctic Ocean and discover Sannikov Land, a near-mythical landmass rumored to lie north of the Novosibirsk Islands. Among his crew, 26-year-old Naval Lieutenant Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak. Kolchak had been a brilliant naval cadet, but service aboard the Petropavlovsk, one of Russia's newest battleships, had bored him. Kolchak had a passion for scientific discovery and oceanography, and a thirst for adventure. When Baron Toll asked him to join his expedition, he leapt at the chance. The dawn of the 20th century is an age of intense imperial rivalry and scientific exploration. Russia, under the autocratic reign of Tsar Nicholas II, seeks to modernize and learn more about its vast eastern territories. Toll's expedition is part of this process, and proves as dramatic as any tale in the annals of polar exploration. Toll was a deeply ambitious leader and expert geologist, but knew little about the sea. His ship Zarya was in poor condition and ill-suited for long voyages in the ice. Nevertheless, the expedition spent 2 years exploring the frozen coast, ice floes and islands of Russia's Arctic north. On one occasion, Toll was nearly drowned by a walrus. Kolchak was pursued by polar bears. In May 1902, frustrated by his failure to find Sannikov Land, Toll took an extremely dangerous decision. With Zarya trapped in sea ice, he set off with 3 men traveling by sled to reach Bennett Island. Zarya broke free of the ice a month later and set off to collect him. But facing impenetrable ice and running out of coal, Zarya had to turn back. Toll and his team were stranded. Lieutenant Kolchak had distinguished himself as a key member of the expedition and a loyal comrade to Baron Toll. He was determined their leader should not be abandoned. Returning 3,500 miles overland to St. Petersburg, Kolchak helped to organize a rescue mission. His plan seemed insane. to reach Bennett Island without a ship, using only sleds and small boats. But in the absence of better options, his proposal was approved. Kolchak postponed his own wedding to return to the Arctic and begin preparations. On the 5th of May 1903, Kolchak's 17-man rescue expedition set off across 600 miles of snow and dangerous, shifting pack ice. Travelling by a combination of dog sled and whaleboat, it took 3 grueling months to reach Bennett Island, where they found no sign of Baron Toll. Just an abandoned campsite, some scientific observations, and a note. "Departing south today," it read. "We have provisions for 14 to 20 days. All are in good health." The note was dated the 26th of October. It was 9 months old. No sign of Toll or his 3 companions was ever found. Despite its failure, Kolchak's daring rescue mission won him national fame and the Imperial Geographical Society's highest award, the Konstantin Medal. It also won him a nickname, Kolchak Polyarny, Polar Kolchak. Returning to Yakutsk in January 1904, Kolchak learned that Japan had attacked Russia's Far Eastern base at Port Arthur, and war had been declared. Here was an opportunity for action, and the service to the motherland that Kolchak craved. He immediately requested a transfer to the front. But first he met his fiancée, Sofia Fyodorovna, in Irkutsk for their postponed wedding. 4 days later, he left for the Far East. The world expected Russia, a great imperial power, to easily defeat Japan, an Asiatic upstart, according to racial views of the time. But instead, the war proved a frustrating and humiliating experience for Russia's military, with devastating defeats on land and sea, leading to a political crisis at home. There was little Lieutenant Kolchak could do to change the tide of war, bottled up with Russia's Pacific Fleet in Port Arthur. He nevertheless served with distinction and courage. As commander of a small, aging destroyer, his main role was laying mines at sea. In December 1904, one of his mines scored a major success, sinking the Japanese cruiser Takasago. But the repetitive nature of his duties bored Kolchak, and he was dogged by ill health. In December 1904, the Japanese got close enough to Port Arthur to shell Russian warships with their land-based artillery. Ship by ship, Russia's Pacific Fleet was sent to the bottom. Days later, Port Arthur surrendered. Kolchak was among the 25,000 Russian prisoners, though as a sick and wounded officer, he was repatriated a few months later and returned to his wife in St. Petersburg. The war had been a demoralizing affair for Russia, and for Kolchak personally, though he received several medals for his leadership and bravery. (1914), the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo sparks an international crisis. Austria-Hungary accuses Serbia of responsibility for the crime and plans to retaliate. This causes Nicholas II to mobilize Russia's army to support Serbia, a Slavic ally. In response, Austria's ally, Germany, declares war on Russia. Soon, all the great European empires are at war. That summer, as the Russian army blundered towards disaster in East Prussia, 39-year-old Captain Kolchak took command of a destroyer flotilla in Russia's Baltic Fleet. The previous year, he'd been described in an official report as an outstanding officer in every respect, firm character, well-mannered, very disciplined. Kolchak was, in every way, a model Tsarist officer. Now in the Baltic, he and his flotilla would enjoy notable success, despite the overwhelming superiority of the German navy. Once more, mine warfare was the Russians' favoured tactic. In the early days of the conflict, Kolchak's flotilla alone laid 6,000 mines in the Gulf of Finland. These operations effectively shielded the Russian capital from attack by sea. Kolchak went on to direct a series of bold night operations, laying mines on the approaches to enemy ports, including Memel, Danzig and Kiel. Kolchak's courageous leadership won him more medals, and a meeting with Emperor Nicholas himself. In 1916, Kolchak was promoted, becoming the youngest admiral in the Russian Navy, with a new role, Commander-in-Chief of the Black Sea Fleet. He arrived at his new headquarters at Sevastopol in Crimea in July. He was accompanied by his wife, Sofia, and their 6-year-old son. The couple had by now lost 2 children in infancy. Across the Black Sea, Kolchak faced Russia's old adversary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Kolchak quickly adopted an aggressive strategy, laying mines off the enemy's coast and providing naval support for Russian operations near the Caucasus. His great hope was to launch an operation to capture the Bosporus Strait, which would be a decisive blow against the Ottomans, and open up a sea route to Russia's Western allies. Russia's first Naval Infantry Division was created for this task and placed under Kolchak's command. But the operation would never happen. It remained a dream beyond Russia's capabilities. Nevertheless, Kolchak's success in the Black Sea made him famous once more, a celebrated war hero at a time when Russians were desperate for good news. Because from every other quarter, the news was of defeat, chaos, and turmoil. March 1917. On the streets of Russia's capital, renamed Petrograd, there were protests against food prices and the huge sacrifices of the war. It was the start of a revolution. The news took a few days to reach the Black Sea Fleet, 1,000 miles to the south in Crimea. Admiral Kolchak, determined to prevent any unrest within his fleet, issued a proclamation. I order all officers of the Black Sea Fleet and land forces entrusted to me to continue firmly and unwaveringly to fulfill their duty to the Emperor and motherland. The very next day, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. For Kolchak, it was a bewildering blow. Duty, discipline, loyalty to sovereign and motherland were all he knew, and he foresaw chaos ahead. In contrast, most of his sailors celebrated the news of revolution in Petrograd. Their life was one of grim conditions and brutal discipline. Finally, here was a chance to overturn that hated regime. In Sevastopol, sailors elected their own Soviet council and formed their own committees. Initial demands included renaming every ship which carried an imperial name. Discipline and respect for authority began to collapse. Kolchak maintained a high tempo of military operations to keep his men occupied, but privately talked of facing the disgrace of a senseless mutiny in wartime. For 3 months, he held the fleet together, with firm leadership and careful compromises with his sailors. But Bolshevik agitators were at work amongst the men. They wanted the capitalist war ended immediately, and Tsarist officers like Kolchak removed from command. In June, the crew of his own flagship, the Georgy Pobedonosets, confronted the admiral. They demanded that all officers be stripped of their sidearms and swords. To avoid bloodshed, Kolchak agreed. But rather than hand over his own ceremonial sword, he hurled it into the sea. "Even the Japanese, our enemies, let me keep my weapons," he told his men. "You will not have them now." A few days later, Kolchak resigned his command and travelled to Petrograd. His wife and son remained in Crimea. He would not see them again. Kolchak had already publicly denounced the reforms of Russia's new provisional government, which he believed were destroying the military. Now the story of his defiance in the face of mutiny made headlines across Russia. Kolchak's reputation among Russian conservatives was sky high. They even wondered if he might be the military dictator the country needed to restore law and order. Such whispers alarmed Russia's provisional government. The new Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, may even have seen Kolchak as a potential rival. So he met with Kolchak and informed him that he was to be sent abroad as part of a military mission to the Western Allies. In truth, it was what Kolchak himself described as a form of political exile. That summer, Kolchak sailed via Norway to Britain, then to the United States of America. He met with President Wilson and senior US naval officers. But plans for meaningful military cooperation between Russia and the Allies were clearly going nowhere. In San Francisco, Kolchak accepted an invitation to return to Russia, to enter politics as a candidate for the Cadets, Russia's last non-socialist political party. But in Japan, en route home, he received shocking news. There had been a second revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks had seized power. Lenin was now in charge. Kolchak was appalled by the October Revolution of 1917. He despised Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who'd soon rename themselves the Russian Communist Party. The chief cause of his hostility was Lenin's plan to make an immediate peace with Germany. Like many Tsarist officers, Kolchak regarded Russia's commitments to her World War I allies as sacred. Lenin's negotiations with the Germans were both dishonorable and treasonous. Kolchak's course of action was clear. As an admiral of the Russian fleet, I considered our Allied commitment to the war against Germany to remain in full force. The only form in which I could continue my service to the motherland, which was now in the hands of German agents and traitors, was to join the war effort against Germany on the side of our allies. Kolchak offered his services to the British. They initially planned to send him to Mesopotamia, but soon backed him for a much larger role. With fighting still raging on World War I's Western Front, the Allies were desperate for Russia to rejoin the struggle against Germany. This meant removing Lenin and the Bolsheviks from power, who that July added to their crimes by executing Emperor Nicholas II and his entire family at Yekaterinburg. Therefore, as civil war engulfed Russia, the Allies would back the anti-Bolshevik forces, known as the Whites, against the Bolsheviks, the Reds. The British now put forward Admiral Kolchak as a man who could unify and lead White Russian forces in the Far East, a proposal that met with widespread support. In September 1918, Kolchak arrived in Vladivostok. Here he learned that anti-Bolshevik groups had recently met in Ufa and established a new provisional all-Russian government. This was effectively a continuation of the provisional government that had been swept aside by the Bolsheviks. Therefore, it had little support from Kolchak and other conservatives, who blamed the provisional government for leading Russia into chaos in the first place. That month, the advance of Bolshevik Red Army troops forced the provisional government to abandon Ufa and retreat to Omsk. Kolchak travelled 2,800 miles by train to join it. On the 5th of November 1918, after much discussion, he agreed to become the provisional government's Minister of War and Navy. 2 days later, Kolchak formed a general staff and went to the front to assess the situation. Across Russia, the military situation was incredibly complex. White Russian forces were scattered on Russia's periphery. General Boldyrev commanded 180,000 provisional government troops on the Omsk front. General Denikin's volunteer army in southern Russia had around 50,000 troops. The northern Russian government, a small White Russian enclave, had just 6,000 troops. They were supported by Allied contingents of varying sizes, mostly in support and training roles. The Allies' most important contribution was sending arms, ammunition and supplies via Russia's seaports. Then there was the Czechoslovak Legion, about 50,000 strong, on the Omsk front. The Legion's story was an odd one. The unit, made up mostly of Czech volunteers, had been fighting alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front against the Germans. When the Bolsheviks took over and made peace with Germany, the Legion had received permission to travel by rail to Vladivostok, to then travel by sea to France to rejoin the Allies. But the Bolsheviks then changed their mind and tried to disarm the Czechs, who fought back. The Legion was now stranded in Russia, but held key points along the Trans-Siberian Railway, the crucial east-west transport and supply route. To further complicate the picture, Russia's civil war raged alongside several national wars and independence struggles in Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and elsewhere. Russia's white forces, fragmented both geographically and often politically, faced the gigantic resources of Lenin's Bolshevik Russian state, controlling Russia's major cities, industrial centers and transport hubs, with around 800,000 troops under its command. It was a daunting prospect. The challenging military situation did nothing to ease political tensions among the whites. They included at one extreme left-wing socialist revolutionaries who'd led the February Revolution. At the other extreme, right-wing conservatives who wanted to restore the monarchy. This latter group had no more time for socialists and provisional governments. They believed only a strong dictator could save Russia now. On the 18th of November, they made their move. 300 Cossack troops rode into Omsk and arrested all the socialist revolutionary delegates they could find. The provisional government was abolished by its own executive, the Council of Ministers. It then moved to elect a new supreme ruler of Russia, who would wield complete dictatorial power. The man they chose was Admiral Alexander Kolchak, a proven leader with a brilliant military record, widely respected, in close contact with the Western Allies. Above all, he was a man who shared their vision that only a return to law and order could save Russia from chaos. Kolchak himself had not sought the position of supreme ruler, believing others were better suited. But duty had called, and he would answer. In November 1918, a coup d'etat among white forces in Omsk brought Alexander Kolchak to power as supreme ruler of Russia. The 44-year-old admiral now wielded authority equal to that of a Tsar, with an absolute veto over all new laws. Despite his sudden elevation, Kolchak did not surround himself with luxury, nor move into a palace. He continued to rent a townhouse in Omsk and kept a careful eye on his expenses. He was joined in Omsk by his devoted mistress, Anna Timirova, who also worked as his translator. His wife and son, who he'd not seen in more than a year, were still in Crimea. They would soon travel to Paris, where many White Russians were now living as refugees. As supreme ruler, Kolchak faced challenges on a scale difficult to comprehend. And it was soon clear that he was neither a natural nor a sophisticated politician. His manner was stiff and severe, his sentences short and to the point. If he failed to get his way, he became frustrated and angry. He clung rigidly to his own conception of honor, both for himself and for the motherland. He was, however, extremely hard-working, well-mannered, and could be personally kind and generous. Kolchak's first priority was to have his position as supreme ruler recognized by the Russian people, the army, and other White Russian governments. Equally importantly, he needed recognition from the Allies, primarily Britain, France, and the USA. The previous week, the 11th of November armistice, effectively brought World War I to an end. And though fighting continued in many parts of Europe, the Allies would now be able to send far greater resources to support the Whites. However, the Allies no longer needed Russia to rejoin World War I. Now they were more interested in regime change, replacing the Bolsheviks with someone less hostile and more reliable. Initially, therefore, the Allies were alarmed by the unexpected coup that brought Kolchak to power. He immediately set out to reassure them in his first proclamation. "I will not go down the road of reaction or the ruinous path of partisanship. My main objective is to build a combat-ready army, to defeat Bolshevism and establish law and order, so that the people can freely choose the form of government they wish." Whether Kolchak really wanted democracy in Russia would never be put to the test. In White-controlled areas of Russia, the response to the new supreme ruler seemed broadly positive. Conservatives welcomed the prospect of a strong leader after so much chaos. But the reaction was not long in coming. The left-wing groups that the coup had forced from power, the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, had not given up. They convened their own constituent assembly at Yekaterinburg, where Nicholas II and his family had been murdered by Bolsheviks just 4 months before. This assembly refused to recognize Kolchak's new government and called for resistance. In response, the supreme ruler ordered local Czech troops to arrest all its members. Several were later murdered during a revolt in Omsk, in which several hundred socialist revolutionaries were killed. Kolchak had shown himself unafraid to use his new dictatorial powers, and such firm action helped to shore up his position. On the other hand, the socialist revolutionaries, his allies in the fight against the Reds until a few weeks before, were now among his most bitter enemies. They accused Kolchak of wanting to make himself Tsar, which, they declared, made him an even greater threat than the Bolsheviks. Elsewhere, White forces accepted Kolchak's authority. General Yudenich in the northwest, Marushevsky in the north, and General Denikin commanding the volunteer army in the south. Areas directly under Kolchak's control were effectively run by military government. Local councils could not be relied on due to their support for socialist revolutionary and Bolshevik policies, such as land reform. Instead, the Whites banned trade unions and returned nationalized industries to private ownership. Wherever they encountered opposition, White Russian forces were ruthless. When an uprising broke out in Yenisei, Kolchak ordered that any village offering armed resistance was to be destroyed, burned to the ground, the men shot, everything of value seized. Hostages were to be taken, and if locals cooperated with Bolshevik partisans, they were to be shot. In the process of crushing the Yenisei revolt, White forces executed an estimated 10,000 Russians, all in direct consequence of Kolchak's orders. the Bolsheviks were just as merciless in territory they controlled. Some historians differentiate between Red and White Terror during the Civil War. The Red Terror was directed from the top, an official policy of mass murder on class grounds. The White Terror was reactive, improvised, and usually carried out by local commanders. It made little difference to ordinary Russians, who suffered untold miseries in this war and died in unimaginable numbers. In economic terms, Kolchak had one advantage over the Bolsheviks. He controlled 2/3 of Imperial Russia's gold reserves, captured from the Bolsheviks, now stored at Omsk, 490 tons in all. By late 1918, there were several Allied expeditionary forces in Russia to assist the Whites. More important than troops were the arms, ammunition and supplies they were sending, particularly Britain. But the support came with strings. Kolchak was informed by telegram that the Allies expected French General Maurice Jeannin, based in Vladivostok, to take overall command of all Allied and Russian soldiers. Kolchak rejected the idea outright, declaring he'd rather have no foreign aid than submit to such a proposal. Eventually, a compromise was reached. General Jeannin would command only the Czechoslovak Legion and some other small Allied contingents. Most of these would be held back to guard supply lines and railways. While some historians believe Jeannin's wounded pride would later have bitter consequences for Admiral Kolchak. The war against the Bolsheviks was always Kolchak's overriding focus. His dream, the recapture of Moscow and Petrograd. From the provisional government, he inherited advanced plans for a major offensive aimed at Vologda. The goal was to break through to White forces near Arkhangelsk and gain access to Allied aid arriving via the northern ports. The offensive began on the 27th of November. The Whites' Yekaterinburg army faced the Third Red Army, which had been ordered to hold a 250-mile front, while suffering from serious shortages of fuel, food, and warm clothing. The attack broke through. The Reds were soon retreating with heavy losses, and on the 24th of December, the Whites took the city of Perm. It was a major victory for Kolchak's forces. They had taken 30,000 prisoners, 120 artillery guns, 1,000 machine guns, and 9 armoured trains. Eager to avenge this humiliating defeat, the Red Army launched a counter-offensive in January. But after small gains and huge losses on both sides, the attack bogged down. The capture of Perm filled Kolchak and his generals with hope, and they organized a new, large-scale offensive for the spring of 1919. Their ambitious plan was to attack towards Vyatka and Saratov, break through the overextended Red Army center, and envelop Moscow from north, east, and south. The offensive began in March, and soon White forces were advancing rapidly towards the Volga River. By the end of April, they'd advanced around 200 miles, capturing territory rich in industrial and agricultural resources, and threatened the cities of Kazan, Simbirsk, and Samara. French Prime Minister Clemenceau and British Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill were among those who sent congratulations to Kolchak. For the Whites, Moscow itself finally seemed within reach. And with military success and renewed international backing, Kolchak's government had never looked stronger. The days of the Bolsheviks, it seemed, were numbered. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were deeply alarmed by Kolchak's success. But extraordinary measures had been taken, which would soon enable them to fight back. People's Commissar for Military Affairs, Leon Trotsky, had overseen the doubling in size of the Red Army within a year. Now 1.5 million strong, it was backed up by the full resources of the state, mobilized under a new policy of war communism. In April, Lenin declared Kolchak enemy number one of the Soviet Republic. "All on Kolchak" became the Bolsheviks' new slogan. The Red Army's Eastern Front received two new brilliant commanders, General Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Commissar Mikhail Frunze. In April 1919, they launched a counter-offensive with 80,000 troops. White Russian forces were soon in rapid retreat. On the 9th of June, Ufa fell, a crucial stronghold of the Whites. At the height of this crisis, Kolchak received a potential lifeline, an offer of military support that might turn the tables on the Reds. Finland, ruled by Russia for more than a century, had declared its independence following the Bolshevik Revolution. Finland's regent, Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, now offered to attack Petrograd with 100,000 troops. In exchange, he wanted Kolchak to recognize Finnish independence. Kolchak flatly declined. Even in this desperate hour, he would not accept any dismemberment of Russia's historic empire. By August, the Red Army had crossed the Tobol River. But Kolchak had a plan. He was sacrificing territory for time to rest his troops and regroup. As Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Kolchak would regularly visit frontline units to see conditions and speak with the men. He would bring extra rations of coffee, sugar and tobacco to lift morale. He spoke always of duty and the motherland. But small gifts and rhetoric could not compensate for his forces' increasingly dire situation. They were desperately short of supplies, including transport, fuel, clothing and weapons. A crisis partly caused by massive corruption and theft behind the lines. While the return of Tsarist-era discipline, which included flogging and beating soldiers, created further discontent. Desertions were rife, particularly among new conscripts from the peasantry, who had little reason to love the Whites. In private, Kolchak was increasingly under strain and unable to control his temper. He looked visibly exhausted, and at 44, his hair had turned completely grey. The rumours of morphine addiction were probably malicious gossip, but the supreme ruler had become erratic and agitated. That August, Kolchak threw himself into planning a counter-offensive to support General Denikin's thrust on Moscow. Great hopes rested on its outcome. The attack began on the 1st of September. Initial indications were excellent. Kolchak's forces smashed through the Third Red Army, taking thousands of prisoners, advancing more than 100 miles, and driving the Reds back across the Tobol. But the great encirclements Kolchak had planned, that were to annihilate Red forces on the Eastern Front, failed to materialize due to a lack of cavalry. At the Tobol River, the Reds were able to dig in and re-establish a defensive line. Kolchak's troops, exhausted by their advance and weakened by their own losses, could go no further. October 1919. Along the Civil War's Eastern Front, the ground shook with explosions as the Red Army launched yet another major offensive. The Whites fought stubbornly, but when the Reds captured bridgeheads across the Tobol, the decision was made to begin a strategic withdrawal. General Denikin's advance on Moscow also came under fierce counterattack. Everywhere, the Reds were advancing. Omsk, Kolchak's capital, was under threat. Kolchak wanted it held to the last man. "If we lose Omsk, we lose all," he declared. But the speed of the Reds' advance left no time to organize a proper defense. The city was hurriedly evacuated on the 10th of November. Russia's gold reserves were loaded onto a Red Cross train and moved to safety, Kolchak having dismissed French General Jeannin's invitation to place them under international protection. "I do not believe you," Kolchak told him. "I would rather leave the gold with the Bolsheviks than give it to the Allies." His words revealed how far trust had broken down between himself and General Jeannin. Kolchak hoped to establish a new defensive line along the Ob River, 370 miles east of Omsk. But by December, this line too was crumbling. A breakdown in relations with the Czechoslovak Legion was the final straw. These Czech troops controlled the Trans-Siberian Railway, the vital artery for the movement of troops and supplies. The Legion's officers now decided the evacuation of their own men would take priority over the movement of Kolchak's forces and supplies. Kolchak himself was travelling east on the Supreme Ruler's train, accompanied by the gold reserves. His destination was Irkutsk, where he planned to establish his new headquarters. Around him, the country was in chaos. White forces were in full-scale retreat. The government's authority had collapsed, and a typhus epidemic was spreading fast. Large areas were controlled by Bolshevik partisans or bandits. Famine loomed. On the 25th of December, at Nizhny Udinsk, 280 miles short of Irkutsk, Kolchak's train was halted by Czech troops acting on General Jeannin's orders. He was held for 2 weeks, with limited communications, as chaos engulfed Siberia. While he waited, Bolsheviks and socialist revolutionaries launched a revolt in Irkutsk and took control of the city. Now, even Kolchak's escape route was closed. Kolchak was now completely isolated. Military disaster had swept away his forces. The Allies had lost patience with his failure to compromise. His authority had been destroyed. On the 4th of January 1920, at the insistence of his own Council of Ministers, Kolchak issued his last decree as supreme ruler, promising to resign in favour of General Denikin. With enemies on all sides, Kolchak planned to escape south into Mongolia, with the 60 officers and 500 men still under his command. He announced that no man would be compelled to join this enterprise. He would accept only volunteers. At dawn the next day, of his 500 soldiers, only 10 remained. Kolchak saw the game was up, and on the advice of his officers, placed himself under the protection of the Czechoslovak Legion. On the 10th of January 1920, Kolchak's train finally left for Irkutsk under Czech protection. "These allies will sell me," Kolchak predicted to one of his generals. Sure enough, on arrival in Irkutsk 5 days later, Kolchak was handed over to the city's new Socialist Revolutionary Council. The Czechs claimed they had no choice. It was the only way to ensure their own safety as they escaped the country. But some Russian historians later claimed it was to cover up their own theft of Russia's gold reserves, which had been travelling with Kolchak. This is almost certainly a myth, though legends about Kolchak's missing gold endure to this day. The interrogation of Admiral Kolchak began on the 21st of January, 1920. He answered questions willingly, avoided implicating his subordinates, and took full responsibility for the actions of his government. But the Bolsheviks had now taken control of Irkutsk, and he knew his prospects were not good. He, after all, had instructed his own officers to shoot communist prisoners. The civil war must be merciless. Either we shoot them, or they shoot us. But then, suddenly, the hope of rescue. Several thousand troops loyal to the Admiral began a desperate advance on Irkutsk, aiming to free Kolchak and other white officers held there. They battled their way to within 5 miles of the city, but they were massively outnumbered and outgunned. It was a gallant but doomed rescue attempt, and Kolchak's fate was now sealed. In the early hours of the 7th of February, on the orders of the Bolshevik Military Revolutionary Committee of Irkutsk, Admiral Kolchak and the last Prime Minister of his government, Viktor Pepelev, were taken from their cells and led to the bank of the Angara River. An order was given. Platoon, against the enemies of the revolution, fire! The two bodies were pushed through holes in the ice and never seen again. With the execution of Admiral Kolchak, the Whites' last pretense of unified national leadership was over. 1920 saw their defeat on all fronts. Western allies evacuated their few remaining troops from Russia. And though fighting continued in corners of the new Soviet Empire for 3 more years, the ultimate victory of Lenin and the Bolsheviks was no longer in doubt. It came at an appalling cost. The Russian Civil War was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, with an estimated 750,000 military deaths, 75,000 executions, 5 million civilian deaths from famine, and 3 million deaths from a typhus epidemic. The career of Admiral Kolchak, Russia's only supreme ruler, and for more than a year the world's great hope for defeating Bolshevism, had ended in total failure. He had faced extraordinary challenges and shown himself a leader committed to duty, discipline, and his own imperial vision of his Russian motherland. He was a skilled naval commander and charismatic figurehead, but was also rigid and inflexible, unable to compromise or forge the alliances he needed to succeed. Under the Soviet regime, Admiral Kolchak's name was disgraced. An enemy of the people, a would-be tyrant in the mold of the Tsars, a traitor with no known grave. Today, a cross stands at the presumed site of his execution, and a memorial stands in Irkutsk. For some Russians, Kolchak remains a romantic, tragic figure who battled for an old empire and stood by his sense of duty to the bitter end. Thank you as ever to the Epic History TV Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Visit our Patreon page to find out how you can support our work, help choose future topics, and get ad-free early access to new videos.